Hi guys, so this is going to be my first abridged episode. We're going to be coding a CLI OAuth authenticator. Now, what that means is we go through an OAuth flow for a lot of applications. For example, my test application was going to be Dropbox. So Dropbox OAuth flow. If we take a look at it, OAuth always has three legs. So the first leg is going to be the user going to a URL in Dropbox. So the user is redirected to dropbox.com/OAuth authorize. It passes in a client ID, which is the name of the application or an identifier for the application. And then it also passes a redirect URL and a response type. Now, I'm not actually sure what's going on. Oh, there we go. Okay, so it passes in a response type, which is code, or redirect URL, which is going back to our server with the authorization code. And finally, it has the state, which is going to identify what user. So if you're having multiple OAuths going on at the same time, you know which user it's referring to. Since it's going to be for a CLI, the state isn't really needed, but I think it's still required by most OAuth providers, so we just pass in a UID. Anyways, going forward, once it reaches our server, it's going to make a callback with the authorization code to our server. So it passes in the authorization code and that CSRF token, or the state identifying the user. Then we obtain the access token, so the server goes out and hits the token endpoint, and the token endpoint passes that authorization code that it just got, and a few other parameters just for verification. It passes in the app secret and key, and it gets back the access token. And then you can go ahead and use that access token to make whatever requests you want using the authorization header. Yeah, that's essentially how you do it. So I started out while building this as part of a Dropbox API scrape, Dropbox photo viewer. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to rewrite it into its own package. Or actually, I'm going to create a package. I think a good name for it is going to be a CLI toolkit. And I'm going to put all my utilities, which have to deal with CLIs, in there. So I'm going to initialize a new repository. It's going to be a node repository. I want to use the new public license. And there we go. We have our new repository. I'm going to clone it down. Clone. And open it right up. Oops. Whoops. My bad. I cloned to the wrong column. -rf, CLI toolkit. That should actually have done it here. Clone. And code CLI toolkit. There we go. So we have our brand new repository. I want to make this into a Lerna monorepo. And what I'm going to do is use some instructions from another project. And actually, I'm just going to copy over all the config files here, and I'll give you instructions on how to set up a monorepo later on. So basically, first we need a package.json. So package.json, it essentially has a few components. So new package.json. I'm gonna call it CLI toolkit. It's gonna have a few scripts to start the application, to test the application, and to watch the application. I'm gonna start the version actually at 0.01. Semantic version makes it say that it is a beta version. And then for the license, I'm going to use the GNU public license. It's going to have a few dependencies: jest types for TypeScript, node types, jest watch lerna packages, which launches all the lerna packages, lerna of course, TypeScript jest, which converts all the jest code into TypeScript, TS node, which runs TypeScript, and TypeScript. So this is the root package.json. So then we need to get the git ignore. So I think we already have a git ignore by default. Yes, we do. And that's when we set up the repo. We simply selected node, and that ignores everything we need. Then the jest.config.json. So jest.config.json, it's going to have a few components. Test environment node, meaning it pretends that it's in a node environment versus a browser environment. It's going to use tsjest to transform all TS and TSX files, and it's going to use the jest watch lerna packages plugin to watch all my lerna packages. Then we have lerna.json. Lerna.json. Let's put it to version 1. This says the location of the package is going to be packages, version 0.0.1. And we're going to use the yarn npm client. That's our license already generated. The README, so we want to add a README and fill it in later. Very important. The tsconfig. So in the tsconfig, I put some options. Preserve symlinks. This is for lerna repos, so that it properly handles lerna repos. These are a few TypeScript rules that I use for TypeScript. Oh, and let me actually start my timer. And one thing I wanted to show, side note, is this really cool tool called bfocus Pro. It divides your time into 30-minute segments. And basically, it helps you refocus every 30 minutes. You take a break every 5 minutes. Another tool I use is called Hubstaff. So basically, you just pick which project you're working on. So right now, I'm working on the Oauth CLI, or the specific task you're working on. And yeah, it tracks the time. That way, you get a good idea of where you spend your time. All right, now I'm going to have to run yarn on this in order to install it. And as that's running, we also need packages and tests. So packages and tests. Now, the way that we check that our monorepo is working is we need to write our first test. And basically, the way that I write my first test is I describe the package, so it's called CLI toolkit, and it just has a to-do, contains, or should contain, a what's it called? Oauth CLI. And this is just a to-do, so it doesn't have any actual code. But I'm writing it just to make sure that everything works. So yarn test. Great, everything works. So now we set up our first package. Our first package is going to be called CLI toolkit. Or sorry, it's going to be called Oauth CLI. And we're going to basically set it up as a node package. So this is almost the same setup as a monorepo. We copy pretty much the same files. So I'm just going to copy them from here. I need this, readme, JSON, not the learner. Copy, then get the tests. We're gonna even get the node modules. And there we go. Now we just need to change a few things. So I'm gonna call it @CLI toolkit Oauth CLI because we're gonna namespace it. All this stays the same. TSLint stays the same, tsconfig, readme, and now we need to fill out our tests. So @CLI toolkit Oauth CLI should run an Oauth flow. So current test, it does indeed run 2 packages. So there we go, we're all set up. So what I like to do is I like to make frequent commits. So I'm going to make a commit, actually initialize repo, git checkout branch. So create a new branch called initialize repo, and let's say I initialized repo. Okay. So now we go here. We create a first pull request, initialize repo, initialized with TypeScript, Jest, and Luna. Create a pull request, and let's see if everything makes sense. Always read over your files before merging. So our Jest config, our test. Let's make sure everything's good here. CLI toolkit. These are our basic packages. We have our basic index.ts here. Let's see, Oauth CLI, great. And the yarn.lock is going to be pretty big, and that yarn.lock. So review changes, or we go back and we say merge pull request, and yeah, confirm. There we go. So now if we go in here, we actually probably want to title our pull request better next time, but yeah. So now git checkout master, git pull, and there we go. Everything is fine. Now our next step is we're going to start building the Oauth CLI step by step. So we're going to go into packages, Oauth CLI, tests, index, and what does it mean it should run a Oauth flow? Well, let's divide it into steps. The first step is it has to create that URL. So I called it get Oauth URL. Now there are a few things going on here. I'm just going to copy what I did here, or I'm going to copy my test first. So get Oauth URL, and actually I'm going to code this step by step so that you guys see how we got there. But I'm just going to copy and paste a few parts for brevity. So we know that we're going to have a file called get Oauth URL. We create the test first. we namespace it, we call it CLI toolkit, Oauth CLI, get Oauth Url. So the first thing it should do is return an Oauth redirect URL with no response type passed, with default parameters. So what does that look like? Well, it looks something along the lines of calling the Oauth URL, and it returns the URL. So I'm going to just copy this test right here, and I'm going to explain it to you. So first we need a get Oauth URL. That is going to be imported up top. So import get Oauth URL from ... get Oauth URL. And that means we have to create an Oauth URL file. We'll do that very soon. And I go just to format it. Now what happens is it actually doesn't open up a browser here, so that's a misnomer. Or does it? I don't think it does. It doesn't. So await get Oauth URL, you pass it the URL of the Oauth. It's actually going to be some Oauth provider.com/Oauth, so it could be like Dropbox.com. Oauth provider.com. So and it's going to pass a client ID and a state. And actually, we decided for the CLI we're not going to have a state, but we are going to have the client ID, which is going to be the key of the application. But yeah, actually, we should pass a state into the get Oauth URL, and then our top tool is just going to generate a UUID by default. So breaking down the URL, it should look like oauthprovider.com, Oauth, client ID is 123, response type is code, redirect URI is going to be localhost 8888/redirect. Now this part's important. Basically, we're going to create a local server that the Oauth provider is going to redirect to, and it's just going to be on localhost 8888 redirect by default, and the state is going to be that 456 we passed. So with our first test, let's actually say get checkout branch, get Oauth URL. Okay, so this is the code for getting the Oauth URL. Very nice and simple. So we created under Oauth CLI, get Oauth URL.TypeScript. Now, it's going to have a default redirect URL, and the response server is going to define it. But actually, now that I think about it, yeah, it's going to be defined by another package or another file called the response server, and that's just because the server is really in charge of managing like how it does that response. So I'm going to call response server.ts, and what the response server is going to have is just this line. It's going to say the default redirect URL is localhost redirect, and it should see that, but it doesn't. Response server.ts. Cannot find module. Interesting. And this is correct. Yeah, I don't know, misspelled it. Response server. Okay then, so basically it's going to be a function, and it's going to accept a URL. It's going to accept the client ID, optional response type. That's optional. It's going to accept the redirect URI, which by default is going to be that default redirect URI. And it's going to accept the state. So everything here is required except for the redirect URI and the response type. And then we define the typings. I always basically pass a hash in here and as the options, and then I define it as the name of the function opts. And then the return type is pretty simple. It's just a string, so I don't even return a type. Anyways, we say, all right, everything's going to be a string, and these two are going to be optional arguments. So save, and let's see if our test runs. So what I like to do is I keep test watch running, and it basically runs all of my test code and sees if it passes. So it passes. Great. That was easy. And I don't know why it doesn't find that module. Okay, it just needs a refresh. All right, nice and easy. Okay, and we're going to say, all right, let's commit it. Git add created function to add Oauth URL. And we're created. Nice and small commit. Go back here, compare, created function to add Oauth URL, create a pull request. Let's go over our code real quick. Get Oauth URL, CLI toolkit, Oauth CLI, get URL. Should return Oauth redirect URL with default parameters. So we pass the Oauth provider.com/Oauth, a client ID and a state, and it returns the valid URL. Now the get Oauth URL, it's getting the default redirect URL from this response server, and it's basically just putting everything together. The URL, client ID, response type, which by default is code, the redirect URI, which by default is that redirect URI, and the state that we passed in. Great. So let's go back, merge that, and I'm actually going to put this in here so that we have a nice commit message. Confirm, and boom. Look at that. We have the next thing, create function Oauth. So I'm going to check out master, git pull, and yeah, look at that. No changes since last commit. Great. So what's the next thing we're going to do? Well, now that we have the Oauth URL, we want to set up the response server. So the response server is a little bit more difficult, and don't worry, we'll go through all of it step by step. So I'm just going to copy and paste it for brevity, and then we're going to change stuff as needed. So response server.ts. So there's a few things going on. First of all, we're going to import a response server, we're going to use Axios, and we're going to use Moxios. Now Axios is a library to fetch, make fetches. So we're going, fetch stuff in Node. So I'm going to say yarn add dev Axios, and it just has like a really nice API, so that's why I use it, and it's very easy to mock. So I'm going to say Axios add dev Axios and Moxios. And we're actually going to do this in the third tab here. I usually have like 3 little tabs open, one for my tests, one for committing and stuff, and the root. and one in the actual package. So package Oauth, and let's see if we can copy that. There we go. Okay, just added it. Now we're going to say this is going to be the Oauth, or sorry, the CLI toolkit, Oauth CLI response server. It should accept a redirect request from the Oauth server. So we start out with the response that we are expecting. It's going to be a token with just a little like test token, I am a token type. It's going to be bearer, and a user ID that we pass in is going to be, or the user ID that we get back, which is just like some extra info, is 789. So what we want to do, let me actually collapse this because this is a little misleading, but we want to start the response server. So it's going to start a server. It's going to wait about 500 milliseconds. It's going to hit that response server, and the response server is going to go ahead and make the token request and spit back that token. So what's going to happen is we set the timeout for 500 milliseconds, and then we have a simulate a redirect from the Oauth server. So the user logged in, and basically just hits that localhost 8888 redirect. Code is 123. We are installing Moxios. We have to do this after we make our Axios request, because this is an actual Axios request. Everything from this point on is a mocked Axios request. So we're mocking the token request inside of response server get token. And basically we stub the request oauthprovider.com/token. We get oauthprovider.com/token from here. Code is 123. So this is just the response code that is generated by the Oauth server. We mock it as 123. The grant type is authorization code. That's pretty standard. Client ID is what we pass in, the key. Client secret is the secret as we pass in. And for some reason, it requires the redirect URL just for verification. We pass in the exact same redirect URI. And this defines the response that we expect. Status 200, response access token, I am the token, token type bearer, UID 789. Great, so we have our first test. Now, here's the problem. This is going to be a pretty intense package. So we're going to start off building it, and then we're actually going to have to branch off. So we have our response server, which we already started here. Now I'm going to post the code to it, but I'm really going to go through it step by step, and it's going to have a lot of different parts. So first of all, we need express for our server. Okay, no problem. So we yarn add express. Now this part we don't know about yet, but we're going to have to at some point get a token, but don't worry about that. We have that default redirect URL. We have some typings, we'll go over them, and our actual function. So it accepts the token URL, which is going to be something along the lines of, let me just show you. It's going to be something along the lines of oauthprovider.com/token or dropbox.com/token. The app key, the app secret. Now we want some customization, such as like what server port we're going to be running on, what the server redirect path is, but we don't have to specify the domain because that is just linked somewhere else. And the grant type is by default authorization code. Now, We define the typings right here, response server opts. So we have the token URL, app key, app secret, and the server port as a number, server redirect path, and grant type. They're all strings except for that port. And what it's going to return, it's going to return a promise of whatever the return type is. I always export the plain object instead of the promise. That way we can easily like deconstruct it. It's hard to deconstruct a promise of something else from another file. I actually don't know how. But it's going to return that token type, and that user ID that we talked about in the test. So what do we need to do? Well, the thing is, this is a pretty common pattern that we do. We return a new promise whenever we have, at some point to resolve it, a complicated flow. Because the thing is, it's only going to get resolved at the point that that request gets paid. So we can't gets made, and it's in a callback. So we can't really await it. But the thing is, we start the server by doing express, and then we listen on that server port that we passed in. Now, here's an important part. Whenever there's an error, we want to actually close down the server. Otherwise, we just have a hanging server. So I wrap everything in a try clause, and then if there's an error, we close the server and rethrow the error. So then we have our get request. So let me actually document this. If there is an error, we close the server. Okay. And let's see. So server redirect path, that's the /redirect. It's listening on /redirect. And in its query, it's going to be a get request. So it has a query. It's going to have code, and it's going to send something to the response. So at some point, we want to do a CSRF check with state that is passed in. And the thing is, I don't want to write that functionality right now, but that's okay. I just create a to-do for it. So it should handle CSRF validation. Okay. So at some point, it's when it does that, it's going to have to make a request to get token. So the thing is, this is going to be a little bit complicated. It's going to be a pretty complicated functionality for get token. So we want to actually write its own file, but let's just assume it does something to get the token. Then it closes the server, and this is actually not a generic response. It's going to respond with the token that it got back, the token type, and the user ID. And let's take a little break, and I'll be right back after. All right, so we are back, and we were working on that response server. So basically, after we get that token, we want to return all that token information as JSON in our server, but also we want to resolve that promise that we made in the very beginning with that information, and it basically closes off the server with that. So that's really all of our response server is doing. Now the thing is, we can't really test this out. So what we do is we have to create a kind of fake get token file. So we create get token.ts, and this is just going to be a fake file, export default. So it still needs to have all the typings. So let me copy all the typings. Get token. Now. Okay, that's all we need. Default there. Great. Now, it's not actually going to do anything with any of these, but it is going to return what we promised, which is a token. And I'm just going to call the token, so what did we promise to return in that test? Here we got to clean up a little bit. X, 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 X. Okay. We promised to return this information. Sorry, we promised to return this information. Final response. So we don't want to write out the logic yet, but we could just return that information. So we import get token. Boom. And it still passes. Great. So what we do is we make that commit, and then we move on to the get token logic. So in my root, created response server. Oh, we're still on master. Get checkout branch response server. Created response server. And now let's check our PR. Create a response server. Okay. Create. And let's see what happens. So for our response server, we we import the response server, Axios, Moxios. It should accept a redirect request from the Oauth server. So this is the final response we're expecting. We do a timeout. We first start the server with the Oauth provider.com/token as the token URL. We pass the key and the secret, and we expect at some point for it to resolve with that final response. Now, we're simulating a redirect response from the Oauth server, the user logged in. So we hit localhost 8088, which is that default redirect with a fake code. So this is the authorization code. We install Moxios. We stub the response from get token. So authprovider.com/token. And the code is going to be 123, authorization code, client ID is key, secret is secret, redirect URI is just for verification, respond with the status of 200, access token is I am the token, bearer 789. And actually, one thing I do want to encourage is to be very verbose in your tests. So what I'm going to do is I'm not going to have the final response. Instead, I'm going to just put it here. Just being very, very verbose. That way we avoid mistakes. So we run it again. It passes. Great. And I want to do an amend to our previous commit. Git add just my shortcuts. Okay. There we go. And everything is very verbose. Now I forgot to mention these guys. So these are to-dos that I thought of which are edge cases. I don't want to actually build them right now, but I do want to list them as to-dos. So one thing is it should handle CSRF validation. It should work on a different port, redirect URL, and domain. We still haven't tested that. It should use a different port if one is taken. That's a little bit redundant. Oh, sorry. If a port is taken, so say we pass in port 8888 and it's already taken, it should just run on a different port. It should kill the server on error, so that's when we do this functionality, the try catch, but I don't want to test it right now. It's a little bit hard to test, and it should work with a custom redirect URI. So now get token, it's actually a stub, and it just returns some static information, but let's make sure that all the typing is correct. So we have the token URL, code, app key, app secret, redirect URI, and the grant type. The grant type is by default authorization code, and it's optional. Now let me just reorder everything, just make it easier to read. Copy, paste, there we go. Easy to read, everything's in order, and good. Let's just amend that again, push it. Now we added Axios, we added Moxios as dev dependencies, and then we added Express. And we're not actually making any Axios or Moxios requests, that's why they're dev packages. So then the actual response server needs Express, it needs get token, and then we're adding this function. So it has 3 parameters, and then some optional parameters. The token URL, which is going to be something like Oauth Server or Dropbox.com. The app key, the app secret, the port, which by default is 8888, the redirect path, which by default is redirect, and the grant type, which by default is authorization. And let's see. So yeah, all the typing's correct. So we start the Express server, we listen on the port. If there's an error, we close it off. We listen to a GET request that /redirect, and we extract the code. I want to do a CSRF check at some point, just a note for myself. And then we await get token, which returns a token, token type, and user ID. We pass it in all this information, and we just use the default redirect URI. One thing is we do want to pass in a custom redirect URI, possibly. Server redirect. So maybe we should add that as an option, even though we're not, well, it's not needed functionality yet, and we do have a to-do for it. So once we get the token, we can close the server, we can respond and resolve. So this returns it to the browser, this resolves the actual promise. Okay, this looks great. So let's merge it, create a response server, confirm. Great. So check out master, git pull. Now all we have to do is we have to make the get token. So get token test. Get token.ts. This is going to be CLI toolkit. It should fetch token. Pretty simple. So we install Moxios, which we already have. Now we are mocking the token request inside of response server.getToken. Same thing that was going on in the response server test. This guy. Let's exit out of a few things. And these guys too. And we're going to respond with that same information we did earlier. Now the token, we want to provide it oauthprovider.com/token. We pass the code, the key, the secret, it actually doesn't need a redirect URI by default, or does it? Oh, it does actually, because that was passed from the response server, and we basically expect that information back. And we want to also do a test to see if the authorization, well, yeah, that's actually checked for. I was doing authorization an old way, but now we just, where we pass in the headers, but now we just pass it like straight in the URL, so that's checked by the mock. And it should handle errors from getting the token. Not sure what that means, but we'll find out. So it passes by default, but the problem is it has fake, it basically returns fake information. So if I do that, it will fail. It'll actually fail both. So instead, we want to fill it in with some real information from get token. Now get token, it's a pretty complicated, well, it's not that complicated, function. Let's see, we basically want this. So try, and we need Axios. So now that we have Axios as a non-dev dependency, we can update this and say yarn add Axios as a real dependency. Now let's actually go through the code to explain it. So when we get back the post request, so we make a post request to the token URL slash the code, the grant type, the client ID, the app secret, the redirect URI, and we get back access underscore token, token underscore type, and UID, just to show you. This is the Oauth flow, and it looks like this. Except it uses curl instead of JSON. So I just converted it, and it looks, the response looks like that, UID. So I construct the URL, it's going to make a post request, and we're just waiting for it to return that data back. We wrap all of this in a try clause, and this handles an error, and usually it returns the error in e.response.data.error, and if it doesn't do that, then we can further debug. But this is how Dropbox returns it, so we might want to have better error handling. Anyways, after it deconstructs everything, it just returns it. And that's pretty much it. We have our Oauth flow. And yeah, that's about it. Very straightforward. So I'm going to create my branch, get token, oops, get checkout branch, get token, git add commit push create get token. Then we make a PR. Forgot about my PR shortcut. So let's see. We import get token for the test. CLI toolkit Oauth get token. We have Moxios. And we stub out that URL. It responds with I'm a token bearer 789. And the token awaits get token. We pass in the Oauth provider / token, which would be like dropbox.com / token. Code is 123. App key, app secret, redirect, and then we expect the token to equal I am the token, and it should handle errors at some point. So instead of returning that mock data, we actually, so we have Axios, I installed that, and actually, I wonder why that didn't make it to the real dependencies. Package.json, that should actually be, so apparently when we install it, git add commit, git add commit append push. Okay, so let's see. We basically pass in the token URL, the code, and the grant type, and it also accepts a bunch of other stuff: app key, secret, redirect URI, grant type, returns back the token, token type, and user ID. So it makes that post request, constructs their URL, and throws an error if there is one, just making the error a little bit prettier. So we refresh, and indeed there is Axios. So go back, merge our pull request, create get token, and confirm. So we have all the components we need. Now to wrap it up, we want to make our initial test pass, which should run an Oauth flow. So to do that, basically we do something very similar as with the response server, but there are a few other little parts. So we're going to have to open a browser window, and for that we use an open command. So we're going to have to mock exec_sync, which runs the open. We need Axios, we need Moxios, and oh, interesting. And yeah, we are going to call this the Oauth CLI, so this is just going to take from the index, and we're mocking child process, which contains exec_sync. So CLI toolkit, Oauth CLI should perform an Oauth flow. Not going to have the final response. We're going to be very verbose. So final response gets replaced by that verbose thing. Now, almost all the test code is the same. We start our Oauth CLI. We have to provide it the initial URL that it has to open, the state. So I'm actually not going to have a state. It's going to automatically generate a state for me. It's going to pass a token URL. So auth provider / token, an app secret, an app key, and that's really all it needs. And then it's going to return I am a token, bearer with the user ID 789. So we set a timeout and we simulate that post after it happens. Well, the first thing that's going to happen actually is it's going to open this URL. Open Oauth provider, Oauth client ID is key, response type is code, redirect URI is the correct one, and the state is, well, instead of 456, it's going to be some random UUID. So maybe we should pass, well, maybe to be called with expect string containing OAuth provider and state equals and some kind of UUID. So, all right. So moving forward, that is what the test is. Now we need to actually create that index.ts. So index.ts is going to look a little like this. So it's going to use that child process in order to do the open. We get the get Oauth URL, which we created, and we also want its typings. We want to import the response server ops, and the response server return, because that's what it's going to return. And the thing is, the options are going to emit the client ID because that's just going to be the app key. And otherwise, it's just a combination of everything that the response server needs and the get Oauth URL ops. So we've got the URL, and this is the Oauth initial URL. The redirect URL, URI, and let me actually use this format. There we go. Initial Oauth URL, and our example would be from Dropbox. Okay, /authorize, and this is going to be the URI. Actually, what is the redirect URI? Get Oauth redirect URI. Oh, so this guy is optional. Let's make an optional section. The optional URI that should redirect or should be redirected, that Oauth provider should redirect to. And the default is redirect. Oh, let's take another break. All right, we're back. So just writing some docs. Now, I actually want to use the TS-doc standard so that we can generate some documentation later. And let's rewrite it a little bit. So we actually define this up top, and I think there's a helper called ESDoc. Yeah. Let's see how it works. Okay, so looks like we need a method description. So it starts an API server, or it opens the Oauth URL, starts an express server, which listens for the redirect when the user logs in. The redirect server makes a request to the token URL and returns back the token in the response and resolves the promise of the Oauth CLI and with the token. Okay. So at param, we've got URL, and let me just describe it. So initial Oauth URL. I wonder how you give an example. Well, we'll figure it out later. Example here. Param. Got that. We actually don't want the state. We want token URL. So this is the URL to fetch the token. Example from Dropbox again. Where do we have it? That's it. Okay. So that's the token URL. Param app key, the app key, also known as the client ID. Example is at param app secret, the app secret. Example, interesting. They follow a pattern, my random things. So that's the app secret. Now for the optional parameters. So we've got the redirect URI, the response code, the grant type, the server redirect path. I think the server redirect path is actually, well, let's check out typings. Server redirect path is by default /redirect. Okay. So, what do we got? Yeah, that's everything there. Secret, oh, and the server port. We forgot. So, what do? We want to write our optional params. So, at param redirect URI. So is that what we want to call it? Yeah, it's really the redirect path. Or no, the redirect URI is something different. The redirect URI, that is the URI of our local server. By default, it is what's the default? Default is in here. Report. Default is that. And then we need param server redirect path. The path on our local server to redirect to. Default is redirect. And all of this is optional. Optional. Param server port. Optional. The port our local server is run on. By default, it is 8888. And what else do we have here? The response type. Response type is optional. The response type from the first Oauth request. Default is code. And grant type, also optional. The grant type for the token which is going to be authorization code by default. Default authorization code. Okay. So that's that. We don't need the state for the get Oauth URL. And what do we? We do. So the state is going to be a UUID, and we just have to import UUID, or before is UUID from UUID. So our terminal running, yarn add UUID. Save that. So let's see if everything makes sense. Response type. Get Oauth URL, I think. Yeah, so we don't need to pass in. There we go. And we can keep that order. There we go. Okay, so what it does is it gets the Oauth URL and it opens it, and then it starts that response server. Now, we already pretty much know everything works. Now, why wouldn't it import? Oh, and it returns the promise, so we don't need it to be an async function. We just want it to happen after the open. Cannot find module dot slash. Index. Interesting. export default async. This actually doesn't have to be async. I wonder why. Huh. So something is wrong here. Maybe restart. Oh. State is missing. In line 41 of what? Of the test. Line 41, Oauth CLI, doesn't actually need the state. Oh, yeah. Can't emit multiple arguments. Well, maybe we could omit from that the state. Okay. Pretty ugly syntax, but it'll have to do. Interesting. Let me figure this out and I'll resume the video.